Victoria Harlan had not pumped her own gas in 11 years, and yet there she was, standing on the side of a Montana highway at 8:30 in the evening, watching the last bar of signal disappear from her phone screen while the snow came down so hard and so fast it looked like the sky was unraveling. She had told her assistant not to worry. She had told her security team she needed one weekend, just one, without a single person following her or scheduling her or handing her a folder. She had built a company worth more than most countries' annual budgets, and somewhere in the middle of all that building, she had forgotten what it felt like to just drive somewhere without a purpose. So that's exactly what she was trying to do. Drive up to a cabin she'd bought 2 years ago and visited exactly 0 times, just to sit in front of a fire and remember she was still a human being and not just a name on a stock ticker. But the universe, apparently, had other ideas. Because her car, a brand new electric SUV that cost more than most people's homes, had slowed to a crawl about 40 minutes outside of a town called Briggs Creek, made a sound like a quiet apology, and then simply stopped. No warning light, no error message, just stopped, the way things sometimes do when they've decided they're done. She had pressed every button, tried every trick she knew, and then sat there in the dark with the heater fading and the snow piling up against the windshield like it was trying to bury her gently. And she thought, for just a second, that this was maybe the most alone she'd felt in a very long time. Not the scary kind of alone. The kind that reminds you that you are, underneath everything, just a person in a coat who needs help sometimes. She had tried calling her assistant, tried calling her driver, tried calling the one friend she had who still answered on the first ring, but there was nothing. No signal, no bars, not even the little spinning wheel that meant the phone was at least trying. She was 44 years old. She had negotiated deals in 4 languages. She had sat across from people who wanted to destroy everything she'd built and smiled at them with complete control. And right now she could not figure out how to get out of a snowstorm in Montana. She laughed a little, alone in the car. It wasn't funny exactly, but it was something. And then headlights appeared in her rearview mirror, moving slow and steady through the snow the way only someone who knew these roads would drive them. And they pulled up behind her and sat there for a moment before the engine cut off. She watched the figure in her mirror climb out of an old pickup truck, tall, moving without any hurry, like the storm was just weather and not a problem. And then there was a knock on her window. 2 knocks, quiet and even, and when she rolled it down, the man standing there was somewhere in his mid-50s, with a face that had been outside most of his life and eyes that were calm in a way she couldn't quite explain. The kind of calm that's either very safe or very dangerous, and you usually can't tell which until later. He said his name was Earl. He said he had a farm about a quarter mile back down the road. He said she couldn't stay in the car overnight. The temperature was going to drop another 15 degrees by morning, and the road crews wouldn't be out until dawn at the earliest. And he said all of this the way you tell someone what time it was, plain and without drama, like it was just the obvious next thing to say. She looked at him for a long moment. She had spent her whole career learning to read people fast, to find the small thing they were hiding or the angle they were working, and she found nothing in his face except a man standing in the snow waiting for her to make a reasonable decision. So she grabbed her coat, locked the car out of habit, even though it was completely pointless, and got into his truck. The heat inside hit her like a wall. An old country song was playing low on the radio. He didn't ask her any questions. He just turned the truck around and drove, steady and slow, back through the white dark. And Victoria sat with her hands in her lap and watched the snow erase the road behind them and told herself it was going to be fine. The farmhouse sat at the end of a dirt road that had disappeared, completely under the snow, and Earl navigated it from memory, turning where there was nothing to turn at, slowing down before dips in the ground she couldn't even see. And she noticed that about him, the way he moved through this place like it was part of him, like the land, and he had some kind of quiet agreement with each other that didn't need explaining. When they pulled up to the house, she saw it was old, the kind of old that has character if you're being generous and needs work if you're being honest, with a front porch that leaned slightly to one side and paint that had been giving up for a few years. But when he pushed open the front door, the warmth that came out was immediate and real. A wood fire already going in the stone fireplace like he'd known he was coming back with company, which she filed away without saying anything about it. Inside was the part that surprised her. She had expected a certain kind of place, cluttered, worn down, the inside matching the outside. but it was clean in a way that felt deliberate, not just tidy but organized. Everything in its place with a kind of quiet intention behind it, and the walls had bookshelves that went almost to the ceiling and were completely full. Not the kind of books people buy by the foot to fill space, but the kind that had clearly been read, spines creased and broken, some of them with little strips of paper sticking out the top, some with notes written right on the covers in pencil. She stood in the doorway for a second longer than she needed to, just looking, and Earl walked past her toward the kitchen and said there was soup on the stove from earlier, and dry clothes she could borrow in the hall closet. All of it said the same way. He said everything, low and even, no fuss. She changed in the small bathroom at the end of the hall, pulling on a flannel shirt and a pair of wool socks that were about 3 sizes too big, and when she came back out she felt, strangely, more like herself than she had in months, which made no sense at all, given that she was in a stranger's house in the middle of nowhere wearing borrowed socks. He put a bowl in front of her at the kitchen table and she ate it, and it was good. Simple but good, and she gave him a name that wasn't hers. Said her name was Carol, said she worked in logistics, said she'd been driving up to see a friend. And he nodded and didn't push, and that should have made her relax. But it did the opposite, because in her experience, people always pushed, always wanted to know more about who you were or what you did, and the fact that he didn't made her pay closer attention to everything else. He asked her questions eventually, but not the questions she expected. He didn't ask about the car or where exactly she'd been headed, or who she worked for. He asked what she thought about the way small businesses were getting squeezed out of supply chains, and then he asked her opinion on a government regulation she happened to know very well. And then he made a comment about a pharmaceutical merger that had been in the news and said it so casually, just dropping it into the conversation like a stone into water, and she answered carefully and watched his face, and he listened to her the way. And this was the part she kept coming back to later. He listened the way someone listens when they already know the answer and they're checking to see if you do too. She laughed at something he said, and he smiled, and on the surface, it was just 2 people at a kitchen table on a bad weather night. But underneath it, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time during a conversation, which was the sensation of not being entirely sure who had the upper hand. She excused herself to use the bathroom, and on the way back, she stopped in the living room and looked at the bookshelf closest to the kitchen door. And that's when she saw it, tucked behind a stack of old seed catalogs, like it had been placed there in a hurry, or maybe just placed there carelessly by someone who never expected a guest to look that closely. A framed photograph, small, maybe 5 inches across, of a younger version of Earl in a dark suit, standing next to a man she recognized immediately. A man who sat on the board of the company currently trying to tear hers apart from the outside. Both of them smiling at whoever was holding the camera like they had known each other for a very long time. She put the photograph back exactly where she found it, straightened the seed catalogs in front of it, and walked back to the kitchen table and sat down and picked up her soup spoon and continued eating. And none of that was easy, because her heart was doing something loud and fast inside her chest, and her mind was already 3 steps ahead, running through everything it meant. But she had learned a long time ago that the most important thing you can do when you find out something that changes everything is to look like you found out nothing at all. Earl came back in from the other room and topped off her tea, and she smiled and said thank you and asked him something about the farm, about how long he'd had it, and he answered, and she listened and nodded, and all the while the photograph was sitting 12 feet away behind those catalogs like a small quiet bomb she'd just discovered and chosen not to defuse yet. She waited until he said goodnight and pointed her to the guest room at the end of the hall. Waited until she heard him settle into his own room and the house got still. And then she lay on the bed in the dark with her hands folded on her stomach and went through it all slowly, piece by piece, the way she used to do in the early days when she had no team, no advisors, nobody to call. Just her own mind working a problem in the middle of the night. The man in that photograph with Earl was not someone you know unless you ran in very specific circles, and Victoria ran in those circles, had been running in them for 15 years, and she knew his face the way you know the face of someone who has been quietly working against you. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that ever gives you anything clean enough to act on, but in the background, in the boardroom conversation she wasn't supposed to know about, in the funding that moved around in ways that always seemed to end up making things harder for her. And Earl, calm, quiet, simple farmer Earl with his wood fire and his soup and his borrowed wool socks, had a photograph of this man in his living room, hidden just badly enough that someone looking would find it. She didn't sleep. When the gray morning light started coming through the curtains, she got up quietly and found the landline phone in the hallway. The old kind mounted to the wall, and she dialed the number for her head of security from memory. And she kept her voice low and steady and gave him the name Earl Stafford and the road name she'd seen on a sign when they turned off the highway. And she said, "Find out everything and call me back on this number." And then she went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and stood at the window looking out at the snow-covered fields and the gray sky and waited. He called back in just under 40 minutes, which told her he'd found something fast, which meant there was something to find. There was no farmer named Earl Stafford registered to this property. She gripped the phone a little tighter and listened. The land was held under a company name that didn't mean anything on its own. But when you looked at who owned that company, it was another company. And when you looked at that one, it led to a name that her security chief said slowly and carefully, like he was handing her something fragile: Edward Stafford Crane. And the moment she heard it, the whole picture rearranged itself into something that made a cold, clear kind of sense. She knew the name. Not well, not personally, but she knew it the way you know a name that appeared once in a legal document during a time of trouble and then disappeared again. A name connected to a congressional inquiry 6 years ago involving corporate intelligence work that was never fully explained in public and was settled in a way that made the name go quiet but not gone. He hadn't stumbled across her stranded car. Nobody stumbles across anything in a blizzard on a road with no traffic at 9 o'clock at night. Her route had been known by someone, and that someone had passed it along, and the man making her breakfast on the other side of this wall had been there waiting, patient and warm and completely prepared. And she was standing in his house in his borrowed socks, having told him her name was Carol and that she worked in logistics. And the almost unbearable thing, the thing she had to press down hard to keep off her face when she walked back into that kitchen and said good morning, was that some part of her was not afraid at all. Some part of her was absolutely, fully awake for the first time in years. She sat down at the kitchen table, and he put a plate of eggs in front of her and poured coffee, and she said it smelled wonderful and meant it, because it did. And that was the strange thing about all of this. None of it had stopped being real just because she now knew what it was. The fire was still warm, the coffee was still good, and the man across from her was still, in some way she couldn't fully explain, genuinely decent company, which made the whole situation more complicated and more interesting than it had any right to be. She had made a decision standing in that hallway after she hung up the phone, and the decision was this: she was not going to run, she was not going to confront, and she was not going to let him see even 1 degree of the shift that had happened inside her overnight. Because the only real advantage she had right now was that he still believed she was Carol from logistics, and she intended to keep that advantage for as long as it was useful to her. So she ate her eggs and she talked, and she was good at talking, had always been good at it. The kind of good that comes from years of sitting across from people who wanted something from her and learning how to give them just enough to feel like the conversation was going their way. She let him lead, asked him questions about farming that she genuinely didn't know the answers to, so that her curiosity would look real, which it was partly, and she watched him relax by degrees the way people do when they think they're the one with the information. And all the while, the small device sewn into the lining of her coat, a backup recorder her security team had insisted on 3 years ago after a difficult situation in a hotel lobby in Brussels that she didn't like to think about, was running, quiet and patient, picking up everything. She guided the conversation the way you guide water, not by pushing it, but by removing obstacles on one side and letting it find its own way. And slowly, over the course of 2 cups of coffee in a morning that was almost pleasant, Earl began to talk in ways that were more specific than a farmer would have any reason to be. Little details that kept slipping through about her industry, about the pressure her company had been under, about a deal she hadn't announced publicly yet and had only discussed with 4 people she trusted completely. And every time something like that surfaced, she let it pass without reacting, just nodded and moved the conversation forward, like she hadn't noticed, because she needed him to keep going, needed him to give her enough that when the time came, she'd have something solid and not just a photograph and a property deed and a name that had gone quiet 6 years ago. What she was also doing, underneath all of that, was thinking about the inside, about who had given him her route, because that was the part that sat in her chest like something cold and heavy. Not Earl, not this house, not even the people behind him, but the fact that someone she saw every week, Someone she had trusted with the kind of information that only exists inside the walls of her own company, had handed her over, and she kept running through the list in her mind. 4 people, just 4. And she was narrowing it with everything Earl said without realizing he was helping her do it. Her security team arrived just before noon, 2 cars moving carefully up the snow-packed road, and she saw them through the kitchen window and stood up and stretched like she was just a woman who had slept well and was ready to get moving. And Earl looked out the window too, and something shifted in his face. Not panic, he was too practiced for panic, but a kind of recalibration. The look of a man who was very quickly doing math. She turned to him before he could speak, and she said his real name. Not Earl, the other one. Said it quietly, and without drama, the way you say something that doesn't need emphasis because the weight of it is already obvious. And she watched it land, watched him go very still. And then she sat back down and put both hands around her coffee cup and said she had 2 things to offer him, and he could choose one, and she laid them out plainly. No theatrics, no anger, just the facts of each option and where each one led. And when she finished, she waited. And the fire crackled, and outside the snow was finally starting to ease. And Earl looked at her for a long moment with something in his eyes that wasn't quite respect, but was the thing right next to it. And he said very quietly that he had known by the second hour she wasn't who she said she was. And she said she knew, and he almost smiled, and she said so. Which option? And he picked the one she thought he would. The name Earl gave her that afternoon was one she hadn't put on her list of 4, which meant her list had been wrong. Which meant she had trusted the wrong person for longer than she wanted to think about. And that particular realization didn't arrive like a shock, the way betrayals do in movies. It arrived slowly, like cold water rising, and she sat with it in the back of her mind the whole drive back to the city. Quiet in the back seat of her security team's car while the Montana landscape moved past the window and the snow finally stopped and the sky turned that clean, pale blue that only shows up after a storm. Has finished taking everything it came for. The person who had leaked her route was someone she had hired herself, had promoted herself, had defended in a board meeting 2 years ago when others had raised concerns she dismissed as personality clashes. A vice president who had sat across from her at her own conference table every week for 9 years and smiled and taken notes and all the while had been passing things along to people who wanted to use them. Not for anything dramatic, not for anything that would ever make a clean headline. Just the slow, quiet kind of damage that bleeds a company without ever leaving a single obvious wound. She didn't call this person on the way home. She didn't send a message or an email or do anything that would signal that the situation had changed. Because the most important thing now was timing, and she had learned that lesson early. That what you know and when you choose to use it are 2 completely different decisions, and the second one matters just as much as the first. She spent the following 3 days acting like nothing had happened, sitting in meetings, answering emails, approving budgets, being exactly the version of herself that everyone in that building expected to walk through the door each morning. And the effort of that was enormous, and also, in a strange way, clarifying, because it stripped everything back down to what actually mattered and what was just noise. The investigation that followed was handled carefully and quietly, the way she handled most things that had teeth, not through drama, but through documentation, through lawyers who were very good at their jobs, through a conversation with a contact at a federal financial crimes division that she'd hoped she would never need to have and had always known she probably would someday. Earl, who she had come to think of as Earl regardless of what his documents said, cooperated fully, and she believed, watching him through everything that came after, that some part of his cooperation wasn't just about the deal she'd offered him, but about something older and more personal. Some line that had been moved on him too at some point along the way, though she never asked him directly and he never said. The vice president was let go on a Thursday, quietly, with a legal agreement attached that took 3 months to finalize. And 2 members of the competing company's board resigned within the same quarter under circumstances that were described publicly as personal, which is what circumstances are always described as when the real explanation is something nobody wants to say out loud. She sold the Montana cabin that spring because she had never actually been there, and the whole thing had acquired a weight she didn't want attached to a place she bought as somewhere to rest. She didn't replace it with another cabin. She took a long weekend instead. Stayed at a small hotel in the town nobody would think to look for her in, sat by a window with a book she'd been meaning to read for 2 years, and ordered room service, and didn't answer her phone except twice, and both times it was worth it. What stayed with her, what she found herself returning to in quiet moments long after the legal proceedings had wound down and the whole episode had folded itself into the past, the way difficult things eventually do, was not the photograph on the shelf or the landline call in the dark hallway or even the moment she said Earl's real name out loud and watched his face go still. What stayed with her was the drive to that farmhouse through the snow. Before she knew anything, when she was just a cold and stranded person in a stranger's truck, listening to a country song she didn't know the words to, with no phone signal and no team and no plan, completely out of every structure she'd spent her adult life building around herself, and how she had looked out at nothing but white, dark, and bare winter trees and felt, just for those few minutes before everything got complicated again, something she could only describe as free.
Thanks for watching my video. Like, subscribe and share.